today.
Poor Wendy.
Yeah, good afternoon, Senate GovRops back on the Valentine's Day afternoon, the 14th of February. We're continuing work on talking about our flood recovery and resilience bill, S310, and we have Wendy Mays with us from the Broadcasters Association, who we have twice now, I think, had to reschedule. So we put you at the top of the list. So we made sure we had time for you, Wendy. So I don't know if you have specific things you want. I have actually a question for you, but I also want to hear if you had specific things about the bill that you wanted us to know.
Absolutely. Thank you. For the record, my name is Wendy Mays, and I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Association of Broadcasters. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of different things in the bill. So I have prepared a written testimony, which I submitted to Olivia. And the last time I testified in your committee, I kind of went off script and went off on a bunch of tangents and forgot some information that I thought was really important. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to try to stick to the script this time, only because I have so much to say that I just want to make sure that I cover everything. So,
like a good broadcaster, stick to the script.
Right. So I'm actually coming to you representing both. I am the Executive Director of the Vermont Association of Broadcasters, which is all of the free over-the-air broadcast radio and television stations operating around the state. But I'm also the Vice Chair of the Vermont Emergency Communications Committee. So the first part of my testimony that I'd like to give is actually with that hat on as the Vice Chair of the Vermont Emergency Communications Committee. So as your committee discusses legislative measures to make Vermont more prepared for emergencies, I thought it would be helpful to give you some background on one of the many tools that the state uses to disseminate emergency information, and that is the Emergency Alert System, otherwise known as EAS. So EAS was established by the Federal Communications Commission decades ago. EAS utilizes broadcast radio and television, along with satellite radio and television and cable TV, to disseminate critical messages in the public interest during emergencies. It can be used nationally by the president or by FEMA, but it's more commonly used locally by the Vermont Department of Public Safety, the Vermont State Police for things like amber and blue alerts, and the National Weather Service with severe weather alerts. So very germane to what we're talking about today. EAS is not only the way that the state communicates with Vermonters during emergencies, they also use the registration-based VT alert database. They use their social media pages, they use the state-owned digital road signs and digital Vermont lottery signs in order to disseminate emergency information in all sorts of different places. So there are a lot of communication tools in the toolbox of the state, and all of them have pros and cons, which is why they're used in combination with one another to reach as many Vermonters as possible. So in this particular case, communications is one of the few areas of government where redundancy is a good thing. Yeah. Although the emergency alert system was created decades ago, it continues to play a critical role during every state of emergency. During the flooding in July and December and Tropical Storm Irene, for example, Vermonters tuned into their trusted stations to learn about road and bridge closures, dangerous areas to avoid, and places to go for help. But the original telco dry pair lines that connect the Vermont Department of Public Safety directly to the radio stations in each of Vermont's 5 EAS areas those dry lines are showing their age, and they're no longer being serviced by telecom providers.
What's the dry line? What's the dry line?
So without getting too technical, it's the connection, basically, the direct connection between the Vermont Department of Public Safety and the radio stations in order to make the EAS system happen. So just think of it as a connection.
Okay.
But it's like a telephone line, but not with a dial tone.
It's the last leg. We have a microwave system that goes into copper lines.
So it's copper based, not fiber.
We have
There's a little bit of both.
Eric Foran's in the room if you can't see him, Wendy, that's who is talking.
Hi, Eric.
Hi.
Go ahead, carry on.
Okay, so so these telco lines, they're showing their age, and they're no longer being serviced by the telecom providers that originally installed them. So the Vermont Emergency Communications Committee is collaborating with the state's Radio Technology Services, which is a division of the Vermont Department of Public Safety. And we're exploring a more modern connection using Vermont's microwave network. So to ensure that the emergency alert system remains a reliable communication tool, the Radio Technology Services is estimating a cost of about $15,000 to make those new connections, which is not in the Department of Public Safety.
15,000? Did you say 1,000? 15,000. Oh, that's so little. Okay.
I know it, like when you're dealing with the kind of numbers that you deal with for the entire state, it feels like that's such a small amount of money. But when it's not budgeted, it's actually, it's a hurdle.
Yeah.
That is why, as the vice chair of the State Emergency Communications Committee, I'm asking your committee to consider adding a one-time $15,000 appropriation to S310 so the work can be completed immediately and Vermont's EAS system can be improved in preparation for the next emergency.
That
Wow.
is the best ask we've had all session.
That seems so doable, Wendy. I think you'll be able to do that. Okay.
I bet you could even raise that just right.
No. Oh,
The hat with the hat.
I don't think so about that. But no, but
Yeah, I
thank
don't
you.
know about
Okay.
this side of the table.
Yeah,
Being very
it's-
helpful over.
You and Bob can chip in. But sorry, Wendy, we're joking and you're not here and that's not fair. So go ahead. Go ahead.
It's quite all right. It's quite all right. Okay, I'm going to add one more. Since you all are in such a good mood, I'm going to ask one more thing.
We had a lot of chocolate.
Because if you don't ask, you don't get, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I would also like to propose that your committee considering adding a modest appropriation to fund a one-time multimedia outreach campaign that could be placed by Vermont Emergency Management with a dual goal of educating Vermonters on how to prepare for an emergency, as well as increase the number of Vermonters registered with VT Alert.
Huh.
So let me tell you about VT Alert. And Eric, feel free to jump in at any time. But VT Alert is an effective tool for reaching Vermonters on their home, work, and mobile phones, email, the Everbridge app, SMS, and teletype telecommunications devices for the deaf and hearing impaired. But currently, there are less than 60,000 Vermonters registered. So using something called the Public Education Partnership Program, which is offered by the Vermont Association of Broadcasters, it guarantees statewide coverage and it guarantees a 4-to-1 return on investment ratio. So just a small appropriation, say, for example, $20,000, could create an effective multimedia outreach campaign to help raise awareness about and connect Vermonters directly with emergency information.
And what, man, just
That's
say,
Go ahead.
so Wendy, why is that just a one-time ask? I mean, to me, that's a like a regular marketing thing every 5 or 10 years. People age out and die and disappear and move, and you gotta keep educating the public. You can't do it just one time.
You're right, Senator. I would love for it to be every 5-10 years, but whatever you think, whatever your committee thinks is appropriate, we would be more than happy to see that.
Yeah, just ask that the VT Alerts is under VEM's umbrella, isn't it?
Eric can say that for sure, but I believe so.
Yes.
I know it is. So because I've asked Eric to come and get all the legislators on it, because
Right.
not everybody is. So I guess my question is, Eric, is that in your budget? And if it isn't, have you gone to approach yet and asked? Because you could ask in addition, this year you're golden, so you could probably ask for.
I do not have a budget for marketing VT Alert. I have a VT Alert administrator who part of their responsibility is going out to municipalities and trying to get them to sign up, as well as situations where they would come here and try to sign up citizens. We have a PIO that also pushes out brochures and social media stuff about it, but no direct marketing campaign. Her situation, Wendy's situation, where they can do a 4-to-1 and really kind of ramp up the amount of money it's helpful for them to jump in. And Wendy's also offered to do a lot of the heavy lift on the marketing side of it. So
Right.
no, we did not have it in our budget. So this would be a great way to.
So this is the way that you would prefer to do it is through Wendy.
Okay, carry on. We'll get more testimony on these asks. We're not gonna just, put it in there. Although maybe Allison will.
So under $50,000, she's doing pretty well.
All right. Carry on. What you got next?
So how many more asks do you have?
That's it, actually. So I'm going to now take my State Emergency Communications Vice Chair hat off, and I'm going to put my Vermont Association of Broadcasters Executive Director hat on to discuss a whole other section of S310, and that is section 16.
Yeah.
So
this is great because I was going to ask you about this. So thank you.
Okay.
yeah, absolutely. I've been chomping at the bit to address this. So I really I have been very much looking forward to being given the opportunity to respond to testimony by representatives of the deaf and hearing impaired community that was given to your committee on January 24th, as well as to ask your committee a few questions about the intent of the draft language that was added as a result of their testimony. So broadcasters, I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
No, I'm trying to find section 16.
It's near the very end. Yeah.
So section 8, oh my God, it must be super near the end. Okay, section 16, thank you.
Okay. Broadcasters are dedicated to the communities we serve and agree that no Vermonters should ever be left without access to emergency information. For broadcast television viewers who are deaf or hearing impaired, closed captioning service is included in all content, except commercials, that is broadcast over the air. I can say this with certainty because the broadcast industry is heavily regulated by the Federal Communications Commission at the FCC, and providing closed captions for over-the-air content is a rule all broadcasters follow. So I just want to talk a little bit about the two types of captioning that broadcasters use. So there's live captioning, where a stenographer listens to the audio of a broadcast, types the words in real time, which are then fed to captioning generators and applied on air, which is why it appears that captions are 3 to 5 seconds behind what is being said. Now, I've polled my broadcast members, and we're not sure if this is the same as the Communication Access Real-Time Translation, or CART, but if it is, broadcasters are already doing it. If it's not, then we are definitely going to need more information because no broadcaster was aware of what CART meant. So just one thing to put a pin in. The second type of captioning broadcasters use is AI speech-to-text systems, which are used on a limited basis, most often for weather forecasts when meteorologists tend to ad-lib. Because of the fallibility of the speech-to-text rubric, broadcasters try not to use it very often.
Right. Well, we found it was pretty bad too.
Yeah. So there are many possible reasons why a viewer might not see closed captioning, and it mostly has to do with how they're watching. So for example, if someone is watching content produced for and only shown on a stream, the FCC closed caption rule does not apply. Another possible reason could be that the closed caption function of a person's television or screen needs to be enabled or rebooted, a process that varies depending on the make, model, and version of the device being used. And although it's extremely rare, it's possible content that should be closed captioned may not be if there is an undetected malfunction with the software that generates and encodes the text. But again, that's extremely rare. So that's the way the language in section 16, subsection A is written. It's unclear as to what organization is responsible for providing CART and picture-in-picture, or PIP. So my question is this committee's intent to have that responsibility lie with the Division of Vermont Emergency Management? Whereas they do hire and provide an ASL interpreter at all hazard events, they do not have the capability, equipment, training, or workforce to facilitate what's needed to deliver CART or the picture-in-picture technique to the viewer. In order to create picture-in-picture, you need 2 video cameras, 2 bonded cellular transmitters, and 2 video camera operators, one focused on the speaker and one focused on the ASL interpreter. So if the PIP is created on site, then a moderately featured field production switcher is needed. If the picture-in-picture is created at the studio of the station airing the All Hazards event press conference, then a director in the control room is needed to combine the 2 feeds coming from the camera transmitters.
Please don't. Okay, excuse me, Wendy, I'm sorry, you're not leaving, okay, you're just cold, okay? We won't have quorum if you leave, so please don't. Okay, carry on, Wendy, sorry.
So I just, again, this is kind of it's a question that I'm putting out there because we weren't quite sure after reading the language. So if it's the intent of the committee to have the Division of Vermont Emergency Management provide CART and pipe services, then an appropriation of at least $40,000 is recommended to buy the set of required equipment and budget for training and overtime pay to operate the cameras. So I'm not asking for that appropriation. I'm just saying, I'm like trying to tell you what the amount of equipment and training and labor is to create the picture-in-picture that is being described in section 16, subsection A. And again, just asking what could be a rhetorical question, I'm not sure, but you know, who is supposed to be providing that? Because if it's the Vermont Emergency Management, they do not have the facilities, the capabilities, the equipment, the training. So you may want to consider an appropriation for that if that's the way that, you know, you're thinking. But well, I'd like to offer your committee an alternative to consider. So instead of including a costly and unenforceable mandate in statute, instead, what I'm proposing that you consider is give the Vermont Association of Broadcasters the responsibility of facilitating a meeting between representatives from the deaf and hearing impaired community and the network and public TV stations so that together we can navigate a mutually agreeable set of broadcast best practices to ensure that ASL interpreters always visible during all hazard press events and to make closed captioning more widely available where it's not right now, which is via streaming. Broadcasters do not want any Vermonters to feel that they are missing out on important emergency information because that's not how we better serve our communities. We hear the very clear message that has come from the deaf and hearing impaired community and are willing to change current practices so our broadcast can be enjoyed by all Vermonters.
Well, Wendy, thank you very much for your testimony and for offering us some options. And I'm glad you addressed this. I was going to ask you about it directly. Eric and I have chatted about it, how to make this work. It is definitely a priority of this committee that we address this issue. But we also, or at least I think everybody realizes it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And I think our intent was to put the onus on Vermont Emergency Management because they are a state agency that we can direct them to do things. And broadcasters are private entities that it's harder for us because we can't oversee the FCC has the jurisdiction, we don't. But that being said, you know, Vermont Emergency Management doesn't necessarily have the skill and as you point out, the bandwidth and everything to do it. So if we were to direct, would you be amenable to us essentially directing you, your organization, and the organizations and offices that represent deaf and hard of hearing folks to get together to do essentially an off-session study conversation and to come back to us with a report on how it's going to happen? Would you be amenable?
Absolutely. It would be my pleasure to facilitate that and then come back and report on what we've agreed upon for sure, because it is a difficult situation, or not situation, it's a difficult problem to navigate. And so I would be more than happy to facilitate a group meeting and then come back and report
That's great.
to your committee for sure.
Okay,
Go ahead.
that would be great, because I think we don't wanna just let it go and assume it's gonna happen. We wanna direct somebody, but we don't often feel comfortable or have the authority to direct a private organization to do something unless you're willing to do it, so.
Yes, ready, willing, and able.
Excellent, that sounds great. And
That's fabulous. Another great offer.
yeah, you're
Still under 50,000.
yes, you're
Well, that will cost nothing.
you're batting 1,000 for sure. So to the other, and we don't have this so much in our bill as well as we want to, but there are other language access issues beyond deaf and hard of hearing, you know, non-English speaker access. Do you have any ideas? Are there services that broadcasters can offer or do in maybe other places that your organization would be willing to consider for some of the more widely used languages in Vermont?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, right now, the FCC only requires that a station broadcast in the language in which they're licensed to, the city in which they're licensed to. But I understand what you're saying, and it's interesting that you should bring it up because, you know, whereas artificial intelligence is not the most incredibly awesome tool out there, it is pretty good with I'll give it like a meh rating. We'll give it this rating with at least with translation. So I think that as artificial intelligence becomes a more widely accepted and widely used tool, I think that's where you're going to find that we can really use it for good, which is to translate. Does that make sense?
Well, it does make sense. I mean, is there any? I'm just thinking, if you're willing to do a study, is that something we could add to the study to see, you know, is there a way to make improvements for language translation as well?
I am definitely willing to add that to the study for sure.
Okay.
And I would be happy to, you know, luckily I have a network of other people who do what I do in all of the other states. And so happy to talk to states where they have a population of non-English speakers and find out, you know, what do they do? How do they do it? So yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, great.
That's terrific.
Are there questions? Senator Vygotsky?
Yeah, I really appreciate your willingness to partner with us on this and to like try to build access for everyone in emergency situations. And I have concerns relying on everyone in the future to have that same willingness and not codifying something that says, no, actually you have to do this. You know, I think about the ADA. There's so much protection in the Americans with Disabilities Act that would have never happened if we were just like, oh, well, nice people will do the right thing. And so I very much appreciate your willingness to partner with us. And I guess I wonder if you have anything. I guess that wasn't really a question so much as a statement. But I do, it gives me pause not to actually codify something and say, no, we're going to do this.
Yeah, so you
I
missed the
recognize that
beginning of the
yeah.
testimony, so I definitely watch it if you
Okay,
can, or read
I will.
it. She also submitted it in writing. So what I think well, first of all, we can't require broadcasters to do anything. It's not our jurisdiction, it's the FCC. So we couldn't require WCAX or take your pick to do it. We can require Vermont Emergency Management to come up with a plan to do it. And I think what I was suggesting is that we require that this report happen, this work that Wendy suggested, and then we require them, Vermont Emergency Management, to follow up on doing the plan. So that it's still, the onus is still on the state to make sure it happens. But if this outside group that's got more skill and access to do the work is able and willing to do it. and willing to let us direct them to do it. I don't know if you were here when I asked if they're willing to have us require that they do it, which normally we wouldn't be able to, and Wendy was like, yes, we're willing to do that, so.
Well, then I'm even more appreciative.
Yeah. Just want to make sure you understood the full picture of where we're going, so, we don't want to let anyone off the hook, so to speak, but we also want to be realistic about who can and should do the work. Are there other questions for Wendy, at this point? This is really helpful, and if you've already submitted this in writing, if you have language suggestions for any of this, I'm assuming the 2 appropriations you asked for would, if we were to move forward with them, they would be appropriated, I think, to Vermont Emergency Management, and then they would have to do a sort of sub-grant with you, for them. Just checking with Eric
I believe so.
that.
I'm pretty sure that's the way it's gonna.
Yeah, because we can't just give you the money directly, so we'll think about that and how that could work. But this has been really helpful, so thank you very much, Wendy.
Yeah, super, super.
And I'm glad we finally fit you in.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you too, take care. All right, we have our next witnesses in person, is Hunter Thompson, and come on up. And
Hunter Thompson.
yeah, we're gonna.
The living Hunter Thompson.
We'll introduce ourselves since you're not usually in the committee. I'm Senator Ruth Hardy from the Addison District.
Lydia Harder, Committee Extension.
Senator from the most speaker and from all the.
Hi, I'm Rebecca White, and I'm from the Windsor County District.
Second Bob Morris, Franklin County, and Al Morris in Randall County.
Allison Clarkson, Windsor County District. So you're the new Clay.
I'm the new Clay, yes.
Ah.
Hunter Thompson, Director of Telecommunications and Connectivity with the Public Service Department. I took over for Clay about 11 months ago.
Yeah, we just haven't had an opportunity to meet you in this committee.
Well, welcome. You're also testifying on a pretty specific section
Yeah,
of the bill.
so I'm here to testify specifically on section 12. But before I do that, I'd like to take a second just as a citizen. And as someone who participates in the SEOC on the state level, just to reaffirm basically everything Andy said, I'm signed up for BT alerts. It's an amazing service. I've had it tell me I need to get home a different way before during the flooding. It's sent me a text message and it's given me a heads up where I needed to get. Sent me a text message. I was able to call my son at work and said, you need to leave work now. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get out of this meal.
Yeah.
Everbridge as software was used. I did a long stint at ADS, and we use Everbridge software for notifications for COVID. For COVID isolation, like you were reported as close contact by the Department of Health, we were able to send you a text that was specifically crafted to meet the guidelines that they set out to say, basically like, you might want to keep it to yourself for a couple of days. And we also use that software for the reminders for appointments when the state was the one posting the COVID things. And additionally, I've only been in this position about a year. I have 28 years of IT experience, and AI, for all the things it does, is horrible. Like, it still can't tell you how many columns are in front of the state house every time. It will go between 5 and 14, but it does translation extremely well. And that's one of the uses where it actually can be good and can provide value to the citizens of Vermont and to everybody who uses it. Is language translation, because the computer speaks just about every language you can think of. And it does that work really well. Before I left ADS, we were looking at using that at the Department of Labor for automated translation to meet some of the language requirements.
Did we use Everbridge? Was that what we used for voting? Was that the same? It was, okay. Doesn't well.
But we did use AI to do our simultaneous translation on our Zoom meetings. It was terrible. So I mean, we had a pretty not
experience.
good experience with it.
I think it was a different thing, but Hunter's here to actually testify about something
Section
separate.
12.
So I want to make sure we have time to talk about that, so,
Sorry.
yeah, no, that's fine.
After Wendy's testimony, I felt the need to.
No, it's totally fine.
Most is reverse.
We're just a
911.
chatty committee, so I wanna make sure we get through our
Curious, we're
testimony.
curious.
We're a curious committee, you're right.
Tanya did raise her hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tanya.
It's okay, I mean, it is on, because I believe we've heard testimony from the director of racial equity that AI actually is not a great tool for translation. Yes, I think what, for some languages like Spanish, it's great, because there's lots of different inputs, but for less spoken languages, a computer can't process like the human intention that, and we use so many idioms and so I do think we might be moving in that direction, but I do just wanna put out there that we
Yeah, it's
heard
very-
from someone
Yeah,
who does this language access work, who actually said AI is not the answer.
mixed results, but,
Okay, so
section 12.
back to my role as director of communication.
Yeah.
Connectivity. Yes, section 12. So my testimony is going to be fairly short and sweet because I'm only tangentially involved with this. I worked with Barb at the E911 board and she has put together suggested language. I believe that's included under my name at this point. So we wholeheartedly support the changes that were put together at the Public Service Department. We especially support the change which removes the references to the telecommunication providers under the jurisdiction of the PUC. We find the change offers a more explicit definition of the carriers that are intended to be impacted by this bill. And the removal of the reference to VoIP and under the jurisdiction of the PUC really makes it much less convoluted. We're in favor of this because while the PUC has decided that VoIP is under its jurisdiction, there have been cases challenging this on a federal level. And since this is an FCC decision, this can change with the whims of who is in charge of the FCC. So by removing the VoIP language specifically, it's going to encompass all the carriers that BART intends to get encompassed by this. For that reason, we believe this is better as an E911 board rule as opposed to, again, under the jurisdiction of the PUC. From a technical standpoint, at the Public Service Department, we see no reason there should be an issue for providers to be able to send this information in. The information exists, the providers have an accurate database of their customers with accurate billing information and address information. And we don't believe that the transfer of this information to the E911 board is going to be problematic. We believe that it's in the best interest of the state and the consumer because it enhances the ability of emergency responders to receive accurate information about callers. I can talk about the changes if the committee likes. Barb sent me her notes, but I also believe that it would be better coming directly from Barb as she was a mastermind behind the language changes.
Yeah, and she came in to testify to originally suggest
Yep.
this language, and so just so the committee knows, she has some tweaks to the language that she originally suggested to do exactly what Hunter was talking about. So those are on our website and they're, you know, from a drafting perspective, pretty minor changes, but I think that it would help for exactly the reasons you lay out, so.
Yeah, I have her notes. I'd be happy to carry her water, but I really think it'd be best for her to come in and explain her reasoning, because it's
Yeah.
all very good.
Are there any questions for Hunter about this specific?
My question is so basic that it's embarrassing, I can't ask it publicly. I'm gonna have, so do we have a definition of what reverse E911 is?
I think that that's actually taken out in the changes that Barb made, so it's not all reverse 911 anymore.
What it called?
Public notification. So reverse 911 is kind of a misnomer because it's not really an emergency service. Public notification that's given out during an emergency. And that was one of the things that Barb and I had talked about actually when we discussed the changes. So that people think of 911 as that call in emergency service. This is a push down notification service.
And this is the reverse, it's pushing it out rather than
Right.
accepting it.
I don't see that. Have I just not gotten it to? Oh, okay, yeah, actually, no, it comes later. There's 41 pages that she has on. She has basically the entire bill.
She put the whole bill, but I think,
Yeah. Okay,
page
go on,
34
page
is
34.
where
Okay,
the change
perfect.
started.
Well, I will make sure our drafting attorney gets this, but it's great to hear that the Public Service Department and the 911 board are on the same page. That was one of my main goals of having you both in, is to make sure you're on the same page with this. So That's great. So thank you for taking the time to come over in person. We appreciate it. Nice
Thank
to
you.
meet you.
Nice to meet you all.
Take care.
Yeah, it's good to have you on board. All our PUD work, all of us are not calling you. I mean, normally,
You want to
4
get
years ago, I'd been in touch with you all the time.
just across the street anytime you need me.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have
Take
fun.
care. All right, so our next witness is also in person and also we've had to reschedule. So Tom, thank you so much for coming back.
It's my pleasure, Madam Chair. Thank you
That's
for
your
having me.
cheery vest.
Thank you,
Very
Senator.
cheery.
Yeah.
Oh, happy Valentine's.
To you as well, Senator. I felt like good cheer was sort of in the spirit. It had a lot of pink on it.
Just to set the stage a little bit, you know all of us, so we don't need to introduce ourselves here and here. But I met with Tom last fall, a couple months ago, saying, you know, I think GovOps is gonna be doing a bill working on the government response to flooding. And so I asked him if he could help collect some information from the employee perspective, the sort of on the ground frontline employees about the government response to flooding and if they had suggestions or lessons learned that we might want to know. Okay, so you did a survey of employees and so you're gonna present the results, I believe.
Yes, I'm
today.
sure that's
So
correct.
awesome. Take it away.
Well, for the record, my name is Tom Abdelnour. I am the legislative coordinator for the Vermont State Employees Association. I thank you, Madam Chair, for that summary of the work here that you'll have before you. And as you said, I'm here today, I think primarily just to present the results of this survey, to give an idea of some of the responses of our members to some very basic and sort of broad conceptual questions about emergency management, rather than to respond to the draft of the bill, which to your point, Senator, had not even emerged at that point.
Yeah.
And in an attempt to sort of split the difference between easy digestibility and completeness, we sent out a survey that included both some multiple choice questions and some free form answers. So I will do my best. I've seen the schedule this afternoon. You have some illustrious witnesses still to come, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'll give you all a whirlwind tour of the survey as we receive it back. You'll see we got a relatively decent response. We got 185 state employees responding about the impact of some of these issues.
Out of 8,000.
Well, yes, but given to be blunt, Senator, given the fact that many of these employees are still responding to some of the challenges created by the flood and their normal workloads, we're always happy when we're able to get folks to take the time to respond in such a comprehensive way as they have here, because you'll see many different responses. So many, in fact, that I've made an attempt on some of the free form answers to summarize some main themes. So
Oh, perfect.
I'll dive right into it and try to keep it at a very high level.
This is great.
Oh, I'm happy. I hope it proves helpful to the committee, Senator. So question one, was your worksite affected by the recent flooding? You'll see there that it's about 50-50 in terms of their individual work sites. And you'll see in question two a little bit more detail about that. The question was, how did the recent flooding impact your ability to perform your job? And I will summarize multiple pages of responses to that with a few key points. I would say that for some folks, either working in elevated locations or working remotely, there was relatively little disruption. But for those who were less well positioned, there was major and in some cases still ongoing disruption to their normal work. And I will just say that this survey, we think, is illustrative of something we hear from state employees all the time, which is that the ability to work remotely is often arbitrarily and inconsistently granted by the state, and in the same sense denied by the state. And then if we were to broaden folks' ability to work remotely, it would really help them remain much more agile in responding to the needs of the state, especially in emergency situations. I will just say as well, another specific theme there is that for those who work directly on their response to issues like the flooding or other emergency sort of situations, they were saying that they have very little ability to do their quote unquote normal work as these issues are going on. So the staffing levels are such that it's all hands on deck responding to the floods, all hands on deck responding to the crisis of the day, and the sort of ongoing work of their departments and agencies, at least in their cases, has to be set aside. So those were the sort of major themes we saw in that question. Question 3, I won't delve too deeply into, but I will just say that there's some really interesting anecdotal information there about the needs of Vermonters who are served by state employees during these emergency incidents. And I will just say there's fascinating stuff about logistical challenges that folks faced in receiving assistance, navigating federal, state, and municipal avenues toward assistance. And a bit difficult to summarize because this was a question asked of all of our employees working across a broad variety of job classifications, departments, and agencies. But if the committee, with its busy schedule, were to have time to delve deeply here, there is some interesting data about folks out in the field. Blessedly for the time it will take to, I'm sorry, Senator.
Senator Carson, do you have?
Yeah, I just looked at find out or build on this question, because this is a very important question. And I would love to know the difference in terms of the staffing levels at ANR, AOT, and a couple other key departments and agencies. The number of people in the key jobs that actually interface with the emergencies, with the exact issues, like the river, people in the rivers and in the river corridors, all the, what was the disparity between the number of people employed now and the number of people employed in 2020?
So, to that specific point, I reached out to my colleague, Adam Norton, who's our strategic analyst, and he has so far been able to generate a sort of relatively higher level, but nonetheless interesting look at the number of folks in those various departments and agencies. I have that sort of high level look here. And I will say that
On which page?
on the page contained in this special spreadsheet sent to me by Adam Norton, but which I'd be happy to provide the committee after I testify.
Okay.
Just as I did this work as an aside to the information in the survey.
Carry on.
I will say that across ANR broadly and DC, in general, staffing levels seem to have held relatively stable in between FY12 and FY23. But where we noticed the biggest shift to your question, Senator, were in 2 areas. One in AOT, where there were something like 50 fewer folks on staff in between 2012 and 2013, and in DPS, the Department of Public Safety, where there were almost 20 fewer folks employed. And those were 2 areas that Adam, in his sort of initial analysis, thought actually were relatively important to the state's ability to respond to an emergency like this. So I'm happy to have him follow up and send the committee a sort of more detailed analysis of those questions, because I think it is interesting. And, I think the majority leader's question really does get to something that folks in this room have heard us say so many times, which is that the staffing levels across state government, particularly in several hotspots, and particularly given a tendency by the current administration to heavily rely upon vacancy savings in the crafting of their budget, has left the state, in many cases, stretched woefully thin in its ability to respond to emergent issues like these floods. So I think the question is.
Yeah, if you can find, if you can send us along once you clean it up and do it the way you want, we can also ask Adam, DHR about if they can do a comparison, sort of vacancy rates in departments comparing those 2 years, because that's a great comparison of, during Irene, the ability to respond versus during the most, we need to name this, but.
2023, I think, yeah.
Gus.
I don't know if we named that yet, but
It was a rainstorm.
yeah.
It's
Senator Vygotsky.
So thank you for this, and my question may not be answerable, but when I'm looking at sort of this 50-50 response of 50% of people roughly being affected and 50% roughly not being affected, I am wondering if it is your sense or if there's any way to find out if that's sort of artificial, because the people most likely not to be able to respond are the people still being impacted by the flood.
It's I think a very interesting question, Senator. I think that whenever I should say as well, this is not a scientific study. Our methodology is that of a scrappy labor union of just over 6,000 members rather than a professional researcher. But I do think that if I were to venture a guess as to whether or not selection bias on the part of respondents might tend toward it being more difficult for those folks to respond rather than less, I would say that my personal instinct would be to say that yes, that is the case. And you'll see a handful of responses throughout the survey of folks saying, who perhaps for whom it was difficult to respond, nonetheless filling out the survey because they said these issues are still going on and it was so important to let you know. And as I said, I know the expedited speed that the committee needs to use when dealing with this issue and response to it, especially given the deadlines of the legislature. But there are really some fascinating firsthand accounts from folks in the narrative sections of this.
Yes.
So I would welcome you all to take a deep dive into them because there are some interesting answers there. But the next question is relatively high level and it's a multiple choice one, which is, do you think your work site is adequately prepared to handle emergency incidents like the recent flooding? You'll see there a little formatting legend. There are a couple of those throughout the document. So I'll ask you to overlook our spacing issues there, but you'll see the answer there is that roughly half of employees and no more than half of employees said yes, their work site is adequately adequately prepared to handle emergency incidents like the flooding, which is about as high a positive number in response to any of these questions as we've found across the board. They tend to hover around 50%. Did you receive clear guidance from management about how to prepare for the recent flooding and similar events, or how to respond to the incident once it happened? You'll see there that over a third of respondents said no, and no, around half said yes. And I will just say, at a later question, you'll see some detail from the folks who said no on their concerns, which we'll be happy to summarize. Question 6, what changes, if any, should be made to your work site's physical structure to minimize impacts from emergency weather events? Some very detailed responses here from folks. A lot of concern, I would say, just speaking in broad strokes, about folks who are located in Waterbury and the specific challenges of that complex. But I would say in terms of big trends, lots of concerns about existing state properties that are in low-lying areas, unsurprisingly, I suppose. Concerns from folks about the use of lower floors and basement spaces for any sort of key operations whatsoever. Folks saying we need to immediately shift all of our key operations to upper floors.
Right, like maybe we shouldn't put all of the servers in the basement
Exactly,
anymore.
yes. Maybe not the best spot. Water and electricity not known for being close friends. So yes, that's right. Trying to move key pieces like that out of the basement and out of the first floor. And also I'll just say concerns about drainage near physical infrastructure. Someone mentioned loading docks in places, for example, I'll pick up that if I had loading docks in places like the Vermont Liquor Warehouse or other places that have a lot of, physical plant issues moving stuff in and out. So improved drainage was something there. I'll move along quickly because I know we're running short on time. Question 7, I'm scrolling down. Overall, how can the state be more prepared and responsive during emergency responses? what procedures, programs, or policies could be improved. This is really where we saw a lot of the concern about whether or not the policies and the communication about those policies was proper in advance of this. So I would say there were a lot of frustrations voiced about communication, coordination, and responsiveness. People saying it was so long before we heard what to do. The plan may have existed, but we weren't told it. It took a while for us to interface with other departments and agencies about what to do. Concerns about indecision on the part of managers with regard to how and when to close offices. So long delays with very little communication until eventually somebody made a call that was quickly rolled out and asked to be implemented very, very quickly. And also, as in the previous question, some specific infrastructure advice. And then the final question, scrolling down here.
Hold on a second, Senator Yoski has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, it may be a question for you. I imagine you'll know the answer. So is every department within state government required to have a detailed emergency action plan? Like we require our cities and our RPCs to have these plans. Do we require, because I feel like that's something we could have people trained on and knowledgeable about ahead of time.
I will say, so the answer is I may not be the person to
Okay.
answer the question about what the requirements are or how those requirements are structured. I will say, though, that one thing that is very clear is if they are in place in departments and agencies, our members very broadly feel that those plans have not been adequately communicated to them. And if they have been communicated to them, they're not implemented properly when the emergency actually occurs. So lots and lots of confusion. So if the plans are in place, they need to be more effectively, I think, communicated to frontline employees. And if they aren't in place, that's obviously an issue of even greater concern.
Well, and perhaps training.
Yeah.
You know,
Like in a school, you
Yeah,
do
exactly.
fire drills
Right.
once a month and everyone knows where you go if, like, you practice.
And I want to be fair, I mean, as we saw, there were a significant number of respondents who said, yes, I was aware of our plan and I understood it properly. But the numbers of folks who did not feel that way, I think are alarming, given how broadly this survey was distributed. And then what else would you like us to know about the recent flooding? And it's one of the points I would make here, Senator, goes to your question, I would say. The frontline employee, this is a trend we saw again and again in the answers. Frontline employees are neither appropriately consulted in the decision-making processes, nor really alerted when those decisions are made. So if there are emergency plans, they may be made by folks without the experience of our frontline members and without their insights into some of the real nitty-gritty of how things would go if an emergency were to occur. And the decision-making about how to implement emergency responses is, from our members' perspective, really opaque. They don't understand how the decisions are getting made. They're waiting to hear what's going to happen, and eventually, all of a sudden, that's communicated to them. So that's a sort of large trend we saw here. The other thing I would say, I have a little note that I made here in my summary to myself. There's a feeling on the part of state employees that the state really can't delegate its duty to prepare for emergency management and to adequately respond to both concerns of internally within state government and with their work with the public. They can't hand that off either to FEMA and other federal actors, nor can they hand it off, nor is it appropriate to hand it off to municipalities and so on. They feel that the state itself needs really robust policies and robust planning on these issues so that when an emergency comes down the pike, it isn't waiting on guidance from external actors, that they know themselves what needs to be implemented and how. So that constitutes my attempt to summarize a very long and wordy document. Typos included, raw feelings included, you'll
Yeah,
see as
definitely
you
raw
read
feelings.
through.
There are a couple all caps things.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is all caps.
Did you submit this to Olivia?
I'm sending her the digital copy.
Okay, yeah, it would be great to post this, if that's okay.
Yes,
There are no
certainly.
names or anything on it,
Yeah.
so.
Should not
To
be.
go to our other work, there we are, deaf and hard of
Uh-huh.
hearing Vermonters are, in all caps, left, out of.
Exactly, I'm like, yes, we're
emergencies.
gonna try to take care of you, yes.
and-
It is actually good to see some things in here, I'm like, oh, we're doing that.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And those are the sort of insights that I hope will be most helpful. I mean, they're broad themes I've covered,
Yeah.
but there will be several little data points that may relate directly to some of the other testimony you'll hear about.
Well, if you, Tom, we have to move on, I'm sorry, but what would be helpful, definitely send this to Olivia.
Yes.
If you spend more time with this and have maybe some bullet point suggestions, you know, like training and planning for emergency, specific to employees, you know,
That would be
something like
really
that.
helpful.
That would be really helpful for, 5 bullet points, and to send it to us, as we're thinking about it. And we are, just so you all know, we also are going to have, Commissioner Vestigi back in. We had her scheduled at the same time we had you scheduled, and we had to reschedule both of them. She's been out of town, so we will have her back in to talk to her about this too, also with some maybe suggestions about what they learned from their side of it. So yeah, that would be really helpful to send that along.
Would be happy to, sir.
Perfect. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you so
doing
much,
this
Mr.
and for all the responses you got. It's really helpful to.
It's super helpful, and I don't think we did this after our meeting. Just great.
It came about during a coffee conversation. How about a survey? Okay.
We're always happy to help.
We asked,
Thanks,
but
Tom.
and the survey was a great idea, because I had asked, in terms of the volume, because I was just getting so many complaints about. Where is A&R here?
I came prepared to answer your question, Senator.
Yeah, no,
And like I said, I'm sure that my colleague Adam will be maybe to do an even deeper dive with regard to classifications, and I'll let him know that there's.
Yeah, that would be great to hear. And then we will ask DHR for the same sort of analysis and see what they come up with too.
Wonderful. Well,
Thank
thank
you, Tom.
everyone, and happy
Really
Valentine's
appreciate
Day
it.
all.
You too.
Yeah.
Treasurer Pichek, thank you for your patience. We are as usual behind schedule here in Senate Government Operations. As I said, we were chatty, and Senator Clarkson corrected me and said, no, we are curious. So we often are so curious that we take longer than I anticipate. But thanks for being here with us. And as you know, we're working on our sort of omnibus government response to natural disasters bill. And one of the reasons that we wanted to specifically hear from you is, well, first, if you have any general thoughts about the bill and what may or may not be in there. If there's other things we should think about, I mean, especially from a perspective of financial stability during natural disasters. But we also are, I've heard through the grapevine that you may have some suggestions for just that. So maybe financing options to think about for how we can build up a reserve for funds to use during natural disasters or emergencies. And what we might do to be better prepared from a financial perspective for the next time this happens.
Yeah, no, sure. Happy to talk about all of that. And maybe I'll just start with a couple of the things that we did do after this most recent flood event in July of 2023. One of which was work within the first couple of weeks of the flooding to advance payments to towns that were impacted. So there are a variety of payments that the state of Vermont makes to local municipalities throughout the fiscal year that happen maybe every quarter or some similar time period. And we sort of reconcile those as the year goes along, but we made the decision, like we did after Irene and after we did after flooding in 2013, to basically prepay the entire year's worth of state payments to those impacted municipalities. I think we had 52 impacted municipalities that we identified with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. So it was, I think it was about $14 million that went out in advance. And so the thought was, the thought on that is that you're basically getting your money now instead of later. So it gives you some immediate liquidity, some immediate money to sort of clean up after the disaster. Obviously, it does not help long term because you eventually need those revenues to be replaced with FEMA dollars or other dollars. But it does provide an immediate boost of liquidity on hand. So we executed on that with the administration and with the Department of Tax and Department of Transportation, who were already all over all of those things. So that was a very good thing to do. And this is now the third time I've done that following a major flooding disaster in Vermont. So that's becoming more of a, you could see a pattern developing after 2011, 2013, and then after this flooding event. The other thing that we did, which was new, we haven't done this before, was we worked with the Municipal Bond Bank to set up a credit facility for municipalities that were impacted by the flooding. And this was out of our 10% in Vermont program. So the bond bank was able to take on $15 million out of our $100 million 10% in Vermont program. That was sort of the amount that they could take on without impacting their balance sheet or without impacting their credit rating. That wasn't the amount of need. That was just sort of the amount that they could reasonably take on. And we announced that in the fall, early winter, they put out a request for applications from the communities that were impacted. The idea here was to provide low interest loans to communities that had to take out high interest loans immediately after the flooding, again, to make payroll, to do cleanup, to make sure they met payroll, all of those things. But unfortunately, we're in an environment where interest rates are much higher than normal. And by taking out those loans, they're paying hundreds of thousands. We estimated maybe as much as $3.5 million of interest higher than what would normally be anticipated. So we entered into a partnership with the bond bank. They went out and asked for communities to apply for this program. There were 19 communities that applied. I believe the total request was like $35 million. So we had $15 million to meet that need. The bond bank's working with those communities to, make sure everybody gets something. And then there's a scaling that's applied relative to the amount of damage that was happening in a community. And that will, those will be executed on after town meeting is the plan with the bond bank. And one thing that we did change, because there was such a high degree of demand for this program, was we're letting the bond bank re-lend out that $15 million if they're paid back early, so that it can have further impact within those communities. And the idea here is that we would be lending out for a short term, let's say 18 months or 2 years. We're giving them up to 5 years, but that the FEMA reimbursements that they're anticipating would come in and take the payments of our loans. So our loans are protected because we are relying on the bond bank's balance sheet. They're protected because we're relying on the relative low risk that a municipality presents as a lender, since they're a taxing, they have the ability to tax. But then also we're relying on the fact that those communities are waiting on a FEMA reimbursement. But if we can replace their loan that they're waiting to get reimbursed for, that's at 7%, and we're providing it to them at 1% or 1.5%, then that's a significant savings for them. So that's another program that we executed on and is in the process of being established following the flooding. And it could be something that we do again in the future, depending on the circumstances of the flooding. We also had to do a report from the legislature asking us to look at climate financing more broadly. And the thought was really to look at how to pull down money from the federal government under the IRA and the Transportation Act. And that was done at the end of the session, so prior to the flooding. So, resiliency obviously took on a much greater focus following the flooding as it relates to this report. But still, the two most actionable items that came out of it, in my opinion, were the suggestion that the Treasurer's Office host and coordinate a climate financing roundtable on sort of a biannual basis. And the idea here is to have all of the entities in state government, the instrumentalities of state government like VEDA, the bond bank, BHFA, credit unions, banks, nonprofits, the federal government, basically everyone that has a hand in climate financing, the CDFIs, to come together and talk about what they are financing, what capital is available for climate financing, what federal opportunities they've identified under the IRA that they're seeking to go after, what opportunities under the IRA have they identified and they're wondering if somebody's going after them, or they need a partner to go after them, or they need more capital to go after them. So it's really a opportunity to educate everybody on what's happening in this space. It's an opportunity to identify federal opportunities. It's an opportunity to identify gaps in our climate financing. It's an opportunity for all those entities in the room to build a relationship and network with each other, because we do think there are some silos that exist, not necessarily within state government, but maybe within state government and the banking industry or the credit union industry as it relates to finance. So we're underway. We don't need a legislative charge, in our opinion, to do that. So we're already starting that work to pull together the first climate financing roundtable, hopefully in the early part or the mid part of spring, maybe in May, potentially April, but within the next few months of hosting that meeting. And then the other thing that we suggested in that report is what we call a sort of a 2.5% climate revolving fund. So this would be based on our 10% in Vermont program, where we can deploy up to 10% of the state's average cash on hand into economic development and job creation activities. And we did send that money to the bond bank in that partnership. But otherwise, we have generally been focused on housing with that money, because we view that as having the greatest economic impact at the moment, building more housing, affordable housing and market rate housing, workforce housing. So with this 2.5%, the focus wouldn't necessarily be on the economic development. It would be on green energy production, electrification, weatherization, and then resiliency. So it'd just be another source of capital that we would have and could deploy, that we'd find partners like we have with our 10% in Vermont program. We'd be able to provide them some additional resources to do more lending, programmatic lending, broad-based lending in those four categories. But primarily, I think, in green energy production, weatherization, and electrification. There's language on that. I'm forgetting the bill number right now, but we've been working with the Ways and Means Committee to get the language that everybody's agreed to into the bill on that. And then the last thing I'd mention, and this sort of came up late in the process of filing our report, but we kind of came to the conclusion, or I came to the conclusion that this pot of money that we're talking about, it doesn't have a huge appropriations impact. It potentially could have some appropriations impact based on the low interest that we lend the money out on versus what we could get from our bank. So that would impact our interest income, but we would do it in such a way that it would be incorporated into the economic forecast. So we just think it would have a pretty minimal impact. Now, that being said, these are loans. This was money that would have to be paid back. So even with a low interest rate, which could be very advantageous, there needs to be some revenue stream there to pay back these loans. And green energy production, electrification, weatherization, you can certainly find revenue streams for those, but sometimes and oftentimes resiliency seems to not come with a revenue stream. Those are capital improvements, capital investments that have to be made. And so we weren't really, we weren't really, and then under the IRA, I should mention, a lot of it is focused on green energy production, not necessarily resiliency, although there's some, I think, money specific to resiliency. So the administration, came to us and suggested that we work together on a long-term resiliency plan over the next 18 months and file that in July of 2025. And it was something I was interested in working on it. I was interested in working with them on it because we were struggling with how do we fill out this resiliency piece from a financing standpoint, both in terms of prioritizing the funding that's available already. How do you prioritize categorize the projects and then prioritize the projects that need the funding first. And then what additional resources need to be brought into the refinancing, or sorry, into this conversation so that there's sufficient money there for resiliency. So that's an ongoing project. We've just started to develop a work plan with A&R, and that will be underway for the next 18 months or so. So those are sort of all the things that we've been working on, and things that have already been deployed, things that are in the process of being deployed, and then sort of toward the future, looking at some additional work and some additional items that we're working on.
Okay, that's a great list. Thank you. We have some questions in the room. Senator Bienkowski.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. So the report that you did on the federal money available, did that look at the federal money that we currently can draw down, or federal money that, or also looking at federal money we might be missing out on because we need to make some legislative changes?
Yeah, the hope was to look at everything. And I think the climate financing roundtable, the reason we want to have it sooner than later is we hope that that group will help surface both of those things, opportunities that are ready to go, and then potential opportunities where we need, maybe the private sector alone can't do it and they need partners in the public sector. And maybe we already have the authority, but we need those partnerships. And then maybe other scenarios where we don't have the authority to do it and we need legislative changes. So I think it's really sort of all of those things.
Okay, that's really helpful, and certainly understand, the giving authority, but I also know, like, one of the things we talked about in this committee is the lack of county governance, meaning that there are certain pots of federal money we just can't access because that's how it's allocated. So not just, I don't mean legislative change by just the authority to do something, but also legislative change that, like, we are out of alignment with money that is available.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to be clear that it's sort of two pieces.
And if we identify those, we certainly will, we definitely will, we'll definitely happily report back to this committee, but happily, and most certainly would include them in any documentation we develop that come out of these climate finance roundtables. Because we don't want to, our goal at the state is not to lose out on any of the money. And then if structurally we're losing out on some, and we can identify and articulate exactly which programs and how much money we're losing out on, that would be helpful for everyone to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And just a quick follow-up, in your sort of discussion around giving the authority to, are you presently relying primarily on private partnerships, or is the state doing this type of climate resiliency work as a state actor?
Yeah, both. I mean, I think it would be both, but I think the work as I envision it with the administration is to sort of catalog the state sponsored resiliency funds that are currently being deployed, but maybe not in a universal way, but also trying to understand what's happening at the municipal level, in the private sector, at the federal level as well, and try to have a sort of a stronger coordination among all of those.
Okay, thanks. And then my last question was around and this may just fundamentally be my lack of understanding of how bond bank works and how FEMA works. I'm going to use easy numbers, but so you're loaning, say, $1 million to a municipality. They're paying you back 1%. That's about $100,000. Doesn't FEMA only reimburse 80%? So is the municipality then still on the line for $300,000?
Yeah. So where the municipality is benefiting with our money is that for that 80, I think, I think the current thought is that they might get up to the 90% threshold. So
okay.
let's hope that they do, and let's say that that's the threshold. We are not helping them with the extra $100,000 they need to match if it's $1 million. Or if the overall project is $1 million and they need to bring 900,000 to it. And then, in terms of cash right now to get the project started, that will be reimbursed. And if they need to come up with that other 100,000, the idea was not necessarily to help them come up with that extra 100,000. It was to help them finance that 900,000. So okay. instead of paying, potentially $200,000, let's just say that, in interest over the life of the loan, Now it's 100,000. So they have $100,000 of interest savings because of the low interest. I think it's a whole nother category to think about how to best help those communities with, with their own match. And I know the league has been advocating for the state to help in that regard.
And then where does that interest go? Is that going into some sort of revolving fund? Like the interest that's paid back to you, what do we do with it?
Yeah. So our principal amount would go back into the cash fund, and then we could potentially lend it out again. The interest that we're earning goes into the interest earned category in our budget. So in years prior, when we didn't have a lot of cash and the interest rates were low, we would be earning less than $1 million on that interest earned, and not a lot of people paid attention to it. I think now it's the fourth largest source of revenue in our budget because we have an extraordinary high amount of cash, and we also have these extraordinary high interest rates. So we're earning something like, let's call it around $70 million plus a year. We did that last year. We expect to do that this year. It'll probably start to go down in the future because interest rates will start to come down. But tens of millions of dollars are earned, and that money that's earned on those loans would go into that category. And then that's available for appropriation.
Got it. So we get to decide what you do with that money.
Yeah.
You said?
Yeah.
Okay, oh, cool. Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Hardy. And I'm not sure if this is the right place to ask this question. It would be about the financing mechanism we might consider for the bill that we're talking through.
Yeah, no, this is the right place.
This is the right time.
Yeah.
to ask. Okay.
Yeah.
Because we, as you know, Treasurer, and thank you so much for being here today, we are not the Finance Committee. So we do not have a financial funding mechanism in the bill to actually put forward the fund that is created, and it was in part coming out of Bill S-145 that I worked on last year. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or thoughts, or if you've seen that bill and seen the iteration of it in our latest committee bill, and if you have thought about if it's something we should be bonding for, or if there's another revenue source. The insurers are who we originally had looked at having a fee to actually cover the cost of the program being created. And then we heard very strong feedback from the insurers, unsurprisingly, that they did not want to experience any kind of fee put on their services to fund it. So I'm just throwing it out there if you have thoughts on ways that we could get some revenue for that. And you've suggested a few, but I don't know if there's anything you've thought of.
Yeah, I'll have to give it some more thought, Senator. I don't have a suggestion right now. The thing I will say about the insurance piece is, that I talked about that in Ways and Means a bit, and I think the point that I imagine the point that the insurance industry made, which I do agree with, is you want to avoid what they call the retaliatory tax, which would sort of it has the potential to really disadvantage our Vermont-based insurance companies. And if there's a way to structure it where it does not implicate that, and you're sort of striking the right balance between, bringing in revenue that will then reduce future expenses, and that has a benefit to insurance companies as well as to the people they're insuring, as well as to the state. I don't know if you can get there or not, but just conceptually, I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And we actually, I reached out to the I think they're called the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, NCEL, and they suggested, just to get some information on it, and they suggested looking at the Colorado law, which has it as a different kind of fee so that they don't experience the retaliatory taxes and fees. And I completely agree. I don't think we would move forward with a funding mechanism that caused that situation, but it's not up to us. So you've got some time before it goes to finance if you have any bold suggestions.
We took the insurance fee out of the bill. We didn't want it to leave our room with a lot of opposition, but we do need a more longer term funding source for a community resilience fund. We have JFO looking at it, and if you have ideas, I know you have brought them forward in the past, or had done some work when you were at DFR on this question, I believe. We also have a bill on our wall about flood recovery bonds.
Yeah.
And I think we actually had you in to talk about that early in the session, or the bond bank. And what we heard was, we don't need to give you specific authority to issue flood recovery bonds. That's sort of in your general,
Right. In your purview.
the bonding authority already. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think also the other thing to think about with the bonds in that way, like, generally we issue them for like specific projects. And if we don't have a sense of what those projects would be yet, then it would, you wouldn't issue them and then hold on to the money because you'd be paying interest on it. You kind of want to issue them and have them readily go toward their highest and best use in terms of resiliency projects. So I guess the only thing I would suggest is this work that we're doing with ANR as we're developing a plan over the next 18 or 17 months. If at the end of that plan, we say, here are the 50 most important, or here are the 10 types of projects that are the most important to focus on for resiliency. And we estimate it will cost, X millions of dollars. And we think current funding streams provide, 80% of it. And for the other 20%, bonding is a potential good source generally for these projects when they come up. And so I could see when we have a comprehensive sort of plan that it might make sense to think about bonding, because then you have an estimate of the total need. But without specific project need, or without sort of a totality of the need, I guess I would agree that we don't, the bonding might practically not make the most sense, but I think we also probably have the authority that we need.
And who is on the biennial climate financing roundtable? It's you and ANR? Is it a specific group of people?
Yeah, that one is really us driving it, although we'd like to partner with the climate office, to the extent that they're willing to, and have the availability to partner with us. But it would be a hybrid meeting, and it's sort of, I have it envisioned off of the Forest Roundtable, where they have 40 or 50 people in the room.
They
And
do huge number of stakeholders.
It would be a
Yeah.
hybrid meeting? Bye, Bob. Happy
Bye, Bob.
Ash Wednesday.
I was waving, you were all raining or something here. Good night. Leave me alone.
Hybrid meetings, those are tricky.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Treasurer.
yeah, so our goal is to make it big, because we want to hear what everyone's working on. We want to establish those relationships and partnerships. We want people to identify, who's going after what federal pots, surfacing what federal money they view as being available that's being left on the table, the opportunities, the gaps that are existing. So if we were trying to come to if we're trying to use this large group to come to what are the 5 most important things we need to focus on, I would be worried about its largeness. But because the purpose of it is to share information and to build networking and relationship, the intent of it is kind of to be large.
Right, okay, that's good.
And this is the resiliency roundtable?
Well, yeah, the climate financing roundtable.
Is that
Yeah.
what you're calling the resiliency work with the administration, the climate resiliency roundtable?
So there's sort of 2 things there, Senator Clarkson. One is the climate financing roundtable. We're doing that is sort of on our own, convening authority. And then there's this work that we're doing with ANR on the climate resiliency plan that is anticipated to be completed by July of 2025. And the reason that date was picked is because there is a greenhouse gas reduction report, I believe, that's getting turned over to the Climate Council on that date. And there was a desire to have both the CO2 or greenhouse gas reduction plan as well as the resiliency plan sort of presented at the same time, because I think there's a need to have.
So one is the plan and one is the financing of it. Is that right?
Yeah, although roundtable.
Them together, so the climate resiliency plan, from my point of view, that might be out 20 years. I
Yeah,
mean,
for
to
sure.
us to actually mitigate all the pieces. So is your financing, are you envisioning something that big as how we would actually plan to mitigate something that expensive for, let's say, 20 years?
Yeah, I think the work we're doing with the administration could identify all of the projects or all of the types of projects that need to be invested in over a long period of time.
But
The roundtable is intending to be more actionable in the near term, that people are identifying so if there is, even though we don't have a broad plan, if there's money available under the IRA that we want to pull down, I don't think we want to wait for a plan to do that if we're going to lose the opportunity. So the idea is that this roundtable is surfacing these opportunities under the IRA, the Transportation Act, and either from the private sector going after them or partnering with the public sector and going after them, or we might have to come back and ask for, we might have to surface, or A&R might have to surface through this work that there's certain money that needs a match, or there's certain authority that's necessary to go after it. But the roundtable is intended to be much more near-term actionable, and the fight and is longer term.
yeah, that's what I was hearing. Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay.
That's good clarity.
Well, this is great to hear what you're up to. And if there are things that we should include in our bill or authority you need or whatever, please let us know. But it sounds, the roundtable you're doing, you don't need us to allow you to do that. That's just something you're doing. So, okay.
But do you need us for the climate resiliency plan? Is there anything we can do to be helpful over that?
Yeah, right now, because we announced it with we developed it right before the new year as sort of a executive administrative exercise. So we didn't think we might need legislation at the end of that process, but I don't envision us needing it, over the next 18 months as the work's going on.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike. It's nice to see you on the screen.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah.
Thank you
if
for your time.
You let us know.
Yes.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good
See everybody. Happy Valentine's
Day. All right, Eric. Oh, and we have Sue. Hey, Sue. Come on up. You can
Oh,
sit with us.
Sue Minter, wonderful to have you for Valentine's Day.
So we have Sue and Eric left. Sue, do you have time, or are you on a tight timeline?
I am joining you remotely, so I can keep working while you're working, and I'm very flexible. So
Okay.
I'll disappear and I'll be in the background when you're ready for me. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Eric, thank you, because we've put you off a couple times, so I want to make sure you get a chance to. And you had some specific.
Yeah, in the interest of
suggestions.
time, I did submit a bunch of very specific
Yeah.
word changes, language changes, nuances. So really from section 1 to section 9, the verbiage that I put in here,
Okay.
and that's the verbiage you and I went.
Yeah, and so most of them are really technical stuff, and I already started talking to Tim, our attorney, about it this morning to sort of get him on it.
Great. So
the-
that we reflected the new draft.
Yeah, and we probably will have a new draft, maybe
So-
Tuesday or something.
This is the draft we're working on now.
Yeah, as introduced. I think.
I don't think I.
No, actually, we have draft 3.1.
Yeah, okay.
Draft 3.1 is the
Is
most
that-
recent.
I don't think.
That's the same as introduced.
Oh, yeah, because it was a committee bill, and so it was a
Draft 3.1 of the draft request is the same as introduced.
Oh, it's just got some highlighting on it. Okay. Well, I'm curious, your response to Wendy, because that was one of the conversations that you and I had about the language access stuff
Yes.
and your concerns about that language and how it was gonna work.
Yeah, I can get to that. If I could just go through the couple sections that we didn't necessarily discuss. One was
Sure.
the use air section,
Yeah,
The which,
urban search and rescue. That
which is
one was,
section what?
10, page
Yeah.
31.
Page.
Some nuance changes in language in there, but what we spoke about was just fine.
Yeah.
Professional funding for that.
Yeah,
It's getting it into statute is fantastic. It's not in statute now.
Right, that
But,
was a big plus.
and then funding is the second phase of that.
right.
With the next couple, there were just small nuance changes. We had a discussion on section 14, which was a combination. They originally were separated and now they're combined. What I call an after action, so the best practices. So we are already in the process of creating an after action review. It's a process that we do for every event. We do it for July, we're doing it for December, we're doing it for January. And we do it for every exercise. So it's a process that we do, and we do it consistently so everyone knows what the end product is. So talking with Senator Hardy, there's some specific things that you would be looking for: early warnings and evacuation orders, designated evacuation orders, those types of things. Normally, we don't go into an AAR with specific things that we're looking for. Organically, things pop up, right? If there was an issue about evacuation routes, if it was a strength or an area for improvement, they pop up, we evaluate them. The AAR outlines what happened, the analysis of it, and then there's an improvement plan that tracks, okay, either we're gonna have a work group, we're gonna assign it to the SCOC working group, we're going to have some specific department look at it, and then we track that improvement plan to completion. So I think we are paralleling this process already. With those specific things, we can look in there and make sure that they did get picked up, because the Senator already said there are things that came to your table that you mentioned. So generally speaking, they should have already developed themselves and already be in there, but we're evaluating to make sure that they get picked up.
Yeah, so just to be clear, so they're gonna do an after action review. We're gonna ask them to do that after action review.
Right.
And add these 4 things on top of the after action review, even if they don't come up in the after action review, to make sure that they get to them. So does that sound like
Yes,
a
sounds
plan?
So not 2 reports, but 1 report.
One report.
We're just adding some pieces.
Yes,
I
exactly.
love that. I
Okay,
love
good.
less reports that duplicate information.
Exactly.
We do as well. And then the second part of this, and we spoke, there's a section in here about best practices about rebuilding. They're very different. So an after action report about how we responded to the flood is one thing, but information package about how people should rebuild, or both municipalities and civilians or local residents, that's something different. So my recommendation would be to break those back apart.
Yeah.
They are both things that BEM can do, and I did speak to our mitigation section. They would need to coordinate with Department of Fire Safety, they would need to coordinate with DEC, but they think that we could probably head it and come up with those processes. It goes back to a resource. We would most likely in that situation look for a contractor to kind of coordinate the 3 entities and make sure that all the information gets pulled and coordinated in meetings. So
Yeah,
some kind of resource funding stream to help out.
do you have an idea of how much that kind of thing might cost?
No, I can.
That would be good, so we have a real number to put in there.
Okay.
And then, but you are, because this was one thing I asked you yesterday, was like, do you feel like you could head that up if you're the right department or?
Given some extra resources, I think.
Okay, perfect. And then how's it, the shelter things, the third?
Yeah, the shelter, we're fine on the first couple sections. It just talks about putting shelters in appropriate locations, so we can educate, and we do already educate municipalities and the local emergency management plans. We have a shelter section, so we talk to them about you should have a shelter, because the idea is that things start locally, and if it's a small event and there's only 10 people, you can house them for the couple hours. And maybe we can backfill some folks. But that's the idea, that we're already gonna be educating on that. The section about funding operations of municipal shelters, that's AHS's in charge of the state of Vermont's mass care program, which is under the state emergency management plan. And mass care encompasses shelter. So you would want to bring in AHS, because they're the ones that deal with, if a shelter in Barry sits up, it's really AHS that sets it up with the Red Cross, and they facilitate it. So the idea of funding all those, that's a big nut to crack, but that would be the avenue that it goes through.
Okay, shelter, and you had said Jason Gosling, yeah, so we'll have him in to talk about it. Senator DeHoski.
So my question is informed by our trip to Barry, actually, and so there's a plan in place, and we're sort of directing a plan to be in place for every municipality to have a shelter plan. But what is the plan if people can't get to that shelter, or if that shelter is impacted by the disaster? Because now the road to that shelter is a river,
Right. And the idea, which again is a resource, would be that local municipalities could house individuals in some form of a shelter.
Well, they can do that. I mean, every emergency plan has some action for shelters.
Yeah. And we differentiate between warming centers, which are daytime operations, and when you move to an overnight shelter, then DFS has to come in and evaluate, make sure that you have the proper exits and entrances and smoke alarms and carbon dioxide detectors. So the idea that things start local and stay local until they go beyond capacity. So like my local town hall can hold 10 people, but it can't hold 75 people. So then I'll exponentially get a little bigger. You need to go to a regional. And that's where Red Cross comes in with Barry or Rutland or CVU, Burlington. So they have those shelters. But yes, the question always comes up, if we can't get there, how do we get there? So there isn't enough resources at VM to run any shelters. Red Cross is strapped to run the regional shelters. So to have 252 local shelters, that would be a very big.
Well, so that's it. My understanding was that was incumbent on every one of our local emergency plans to have shelters identified and have volunteers online to staff them and run them. Is that not the case?
The local emergency management plan has a section that you can outline where you have local shelters. It does not impose a mandate on them to have a staff funded run.
But it would be in the interest of every municipality, in every community to have an identified local shelter and a system for how it gets put into action fast.
That's correct. And we teach that, we imply that, but we cannot mandate that. And we do things like we've had local grant money for generators to go to shelters. If you have local EOCs, we've had money that we give out for that. So we try to.
Do you still have that local generator?
That one closed, that specific one closed, but we have some other ones that could be utilized for that.
We could, I mean, so you don't have the capacity to require everybody, but we could require that every municipality have an identified shelter in their emergency plan. The legislature could require it now, whether they have the capacity to staff it and run it and all those things is another question, but at least identifying it is something.
And some of them identify that regional shelter as well.
Yeah.
Because they know they don't have the capacity.
And we did a lot of volunteers, but I'm just curious, just to finish on the generator thing. One of the challenges is the generator part and who keeps their generators current. Is there any FEMA grant program for emergency shelter generators?
Not shelters, emergency operations centers, but if you co-house them,
Oh, there you go.
then you'd be able to have, like in Bristol, the emergency operations center. One of the shelters is all in the same town hall.
Town hall.
But we had some money under EMPG, which is FEMA money,
Emergency management
preparedness grant, which is funds a significant portion of the EM.
Right.
And we were able to allocate some money and we specifically set it up for shelters and EOCs. And it was for building an EOC if you needed computers, if you needed to take a closet in your town hall and turn it into an actual SCOC, some minor buildings. But one of the big things that we spent money on was generators because it's a need out there.
Is that still open?
It is not. We've obligated all the money.
Senator Biehoski.
Yeah, so you said you train municipalities and suggest that they identify a shelter. Do you also provide training and support in evaluating what a likely good shelter space is? Like in Barry, it's on the top of a big hill, which is probably great if we're talking about flooding. And like, do you help the municipalities do any evaluation about like, if I choose my shelter in a floodplain on the bank of the river?
I hate to keep pulling the line about capacity, but out of 252 towns, I have 3 regional coordinators to cover those towns. So
Yeah, we already heard that was a.
I did get one more, so now I'm up to 4.
There you go.
But when they go out to those towns, those are the conversations they had. But in the same vein, town only has one community center.
Yeah.
It's been there since 18 whatever, and they can't move it, and there's no other building. So a lot of times what they'll do is go to a neighboring town or they'll go to the regional. So yes, we have those conversations with them. Sometimes there's just nothing they can do about it. But again, it goes back to resources. I'm sure every time we love to do a EOC/shelter that's fully operational with a generator and 24-hour staff, but it's something that they can't do. So that's when it goes to that regional thing, just for resources. We also have that most Vermonters don't like to go to shelters. So when you stand up a bunch of shelters, a lot of times they'll say empty overnight. We still do it because during this last flood, you saw that there was it's called a census. Overnight, there was a census of individuals in there. But a lot of times what you'll get is an inflow of daytime. Go in, charge your phone, get a hot coffee, be out of your house. It's cold, but most
That's
people will
okay,
go
too.
back.
I mean, that's
Yeah, and
also
we've done
neat.
that. And we try, and we are developing, or AHS is developing a shelter plan. So we've done things in the past, like armories would open up as,
Yeah,
they're not great for overnight, but they're good for going in and getting a cup of coffee and.
And you know what else is? Libraries.
and
Correct.
schools.
Yes.
And that's what happens. You get a groundswelling of places that kind of pop up and they'll say, hey, come here for a cup of coffee, or, you know, the local Grange or the local community center says, yeah, we're not the shelter, but you can come here and get out of the cold and come in and have some coffee and a donut. So things like that happen, and it's hard to.
All that healthy
quantify.
food you're offering.
Yeah,
Coffee,
exactly.
come in for a salad.
Come for
Yeah,
salad, so.
We have
carrots and
Sue
celery.
waiting, so I don't wanna take too much
Yeah,
time.
The other
but,
thing you wanted to touch
yeah,
base
go
on
ahead.
was the broadcasters.
Yeah.
Yeah, my suggestion was a working group to try to figure that out. Is putting the onus on VEM is the same to me as putting the onus. You don't have the ability to tell broadcasters to do it. I don't have the ability to tell the broadcasters.
Right.
And I totally agree with the Broadcasting Association. We want every Vermonter to hear our message. That is.
Sure you
It's something.
And
that we want.
understand it,
And
hear it
understand.
and
And
understand.
understand. And we were working on that by translating all of our websites and making sure that our social media goes out in a way
Right.
that they can understand. So during the flood, there was some situations, we didn't get an interpreter for the first one. I believe Laura from the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Association made the comment, there's not a lot of them out there. So it wasn't necessarily that we didn't try to do it or want to do it, but we don't have a cadre of them to do. So that's an issue, right? If it's a spur of the moment press conference, I don't have an in-house translator. So things like that, like, we want to do it. So if you mandate us to do it, well, we already want to do it. But
Right.
we don't have, or there is not the capabilities to do it. So if the broadcasters can work on the cards and the picture-in-picture, and then we will be more than happy to use them.
Right,
The other option that she mentioned is I have to have a broadcast station and
Right.
I become a television operator.
Well, I think what we would, as I was explaining to Senator Yoski, is, you know, we would, in the bill, set up that working
Yeah, I
group or
think that's
whatever.
right.
But then ultimately, it would be your responsibility to follow through on whatever they're recommending.
Yeah, and if the final mandate is for VEM to use these technologies in an emergency, my answer is yes, as long as they're
As
there.
long
you're
as
ready to do it.
I mean, there's certain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's costs for them, but yeah, we'd be happy to use them, right now, there's somewhat available, not easily available, but yeah.
Well, thank you for these suggestions. We're gonna. you know,
Yeah, and the
work
last
on-
one was the
Oh,
climate
sorry.
resilience officer. So
Right.
yes.
You-
we're proposing a study group because as it's written in here, it would be in the division of VEM, which is under the Department of Public Safety, and that would just make, not that I don't want another personnel, but it may be too far down. It may be something that needs to be higher, but then there's already the Climate Action Council and there's a
Right.
bunch of other things, and every agency has resilience officers now. So we're all looking at it. So how is it bigger than just VEM?
Oh,
Right,
got
right.
it.
We have our mitigation and resiliency section, obviously makes a lot of sense to fit there, but I feel like it might not have the gravitas that it might need.
Yeah.
And I think it's
Could you-
higher in most other states.
Can you, do you have a, what is it called?
Chart?
A work chart that you could share with us for
Of VEM.
VM?
Sure.
That would be helpful to sort of see and, how you're organized and who does what.
So yeah, for that one, we have directors and then I have 4 section chiefs, and one of the sections is mitigation.
Okay.
So
So
that's,
I also like to clarify something that you said, Eric. You say every department or every agency has a resiliency officer?
they're working in resilience. I don't know if they have an official
Because
resiliency
we-
officer.
And so what we're talking about is one czar or czarina of resiliency?
That's what's in the bill right now is the chief
The
resilience
Wonder
officer.
Woman of resiliency,
I,
who oversees all the resilience officers all over.
that was my assumption, is some kind of coordinating entity to make sure that we're not 30 agencies doing 30 different things.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not the right, maybe that's not the right position, but we'll continue to talk to you about it and think about it.
And I know other states have a
Yeah,
CROs.
exactly, they do. So that's what the thought was in the bill, but, okay, thank you. As you know, stay tuned
Yeah.
as the
I'll be here
broadcasters
tonight.
stay.
So I've had the pleasure of having Eric both in the morning and in the
That's-
afternoon.
He's a busy
Happy
guy.
to do it.
It's
It's the season.
theme of the session,
It's
for
the-
sure.
It's wonderful.
Sue, thank you so much for your patience and waiting. I don't know if you've had a chance to skim through the bill, but we're working on a bill that's about government response to climate, natural disasters in the wake of the flooding. We know you have a ton of experience with this, not only now with your organization, but in the past with Irene. So we definitely wanted to hear your thoughts on the bill or anything that you thought we should make sure we include or think about, and also what's going on right now with the work you're doing in the wake of the flood.
So she was our czarina.
Yeah.
And it was a total treat to work with you on that. That was
But to that point, first of all, thank you all for allowing me to join you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. I'm in a little cubby in my office, which is busy. And nice to hear Eric. For those who, just as a matter of acknowledging my position is as Executive Director of Capstone Community Action, which is one of 5 community action agencies, anti-poverty organizations established in the war on poverty of the 1960s, and we are still at it. And we all network together as VCAP. And I do think it's relevant, and I have to tell you, listening to the previous 2 testimonies, it was I've been in the very questions that you're asking, and while it's true, I was the recovery officer. I was redeployed to be the Secretary of Transportation, and there wasn't a resilience officer. And I think a chief resilience officer is a great recommendation. And I think Eric raises a very important point, because it was my recommendation that we actually elevate. We did create, after Irene, a new section, which is doing a lot of this hazard mitigation work that you're talking about, which is really resilience and might be a good location. But the truth is, to Eric's point, and what I think was so important for our recovery after Irene and now, is to have a position of authority in the governor's office. That issue of the org chart is extremely important in state government, because who reports to who is essential, particularly in emergencies. But even as we look ahead, and I want to get to my actual testimony, which you do have a copy of, so I'm not going to read anything, but you can look at it. But looking ahead, yes, some of the other departments and agencies of state government are thinking about resilience, but there's such a complex and different sectors that need to be brought together, I believe, to really be effective, which is why, yes, I think it is true to have someone at a high level thinking about the future. And so, in addition to being the current executive director at Capstone, it is relevant that I was, the chief recovery officer, called the Irene Recovery Officer, for really almost 2.5 years after Irene in 2011. But I wasn't the first. The first was Neil Lunderville, who really set a course of our recovery. And I think there were so many interesting differences and parallels between these 2 moments in our state's history that are worth reflecting upon. I haven't read the bill, I've read the summary, so I kind of have a sense of what you're thinking about. And I'm so pleased that you're thinking about all of what you are. And, after Irene, I had been the transportation secretary, and in Irene, we had, I think you may know, such a tremendous impact to our infrastructure. 600 miles of road gone, 200 bridges, state bridges gone, thousands of culverts and bridges on the town system. So, and as you may recall, or maybe you don't, the Waterbury State Office Complex, where the Emergency Operations Center was living at the time, was completely wiped out. So there was no Emergency Operations Center at the very height of the storm. And as it turned out, the Agency of Transportation sort of decided to mobilize our incident command centers in the areas of greatest impact. And I will say that's just a bit of a difference. Because I heard you referring to, maybe the absence of certain ANR or other. I feel like the state had a lower level of engagement right from the get-go after Irene, because of the kind of storm it was and the level of impact. And I got to realize with, garages in every region of the state, agencies of transportation across the country are often the first responders to these kinds of incidents that are like us, dealing with flood and intensive storm damage. And if people can't get out, it gets worse, it accelerates. So often this is an important role. In this particular storm of July 2013 and in December, and I will tell you, I think it had a lot to do with some of our resilient recovery from Irene. The scale of impact to infrastructure was far less. And I think and we didn't lose the Emergency Operations Center. It mobilized quickly. And I think that the state in this incident did what it is supposed to do. And we never did after Irene, which is to co-locate with FEMA. And I can come back to that. I think it reflects a difference in how we sit today versus then. But I really want to say that this concept of resilience, after Irene, and I was very focused on, and Governor Shumlin from day one was saying, we're going to build back stronger. Because, we knew at that time, and by the way, as the Secretary of Transportation in 2011, I was the only Secretary of Transportation in the country who was even allowed to use the word climate change. Wow. So it was a different time. But I think our state was looking at this disaster as a climate-induced disaster that we needed to think differently from, and we did. We did in particular in terms of how we rebuilt roads and bridges. And I really feel proud of our state employees and our federal partners, especially the Federal Highway Administration, with whom we went on scan tours. We had a very interagency focus and approach to how do we rebuild this unbelievable historic infrastructure damage. So over this time, I think resilience after Irene, at least from my perspective, often meant infrastructure rebuilding. So building back stronger, thinking differently about the size of roads, of bridges, of culverts, of how we recontour our river systems so that they meander and they reduce velocity and the power and the destruction. We also focused a lot on home buyouts. And this is a critical issue that I think you're going to touch on that I want to come back to. But I want to tell you that right now, from where I sit, I'm thinking about resilience in terms of individuals. And because it is our mission to work with low-income people, I really want to recognize, and I want you all to hear clearly, that it is always the most vulnerable who face a disproportionate risk to the climate disaster and who have the longest and greatest struggle to recovering. And in this particular disaster of July 11th, my headquarters is in Barre, Vermont, one of our the communities that have been impacted and devastated is a very large housing stock, particularly affordable housing. And of course, this comes amidst a housing crisis. I often say, before COVID, we had a housing shortage. During COVID, it turned into a housing crisis. And with the flood on top of this, it is a housing emergency. And I know Senator Clarkson has heard me say this before, but it is so extreme. So I want to just say, say from where I sit today and the role I play as a director of an anti-poverty organization, and we are having a specific role with the long-term recovery right now, but I want you to be thinking also in your bill about individuals and how we do better to set up systems quickly so that we are in a better place 7 months from a disaster than we are today. Our organization, and I think that the nonprofit community has an important role to play, because when the state is set up, VEM, I mean, Senator, you asked me to reflect on the role of government. It's chaotic, but it's organized chaos because they have an incident command system. They've actually done training and they have preparedness and they have strategies. But that's from really high up. And it's really different on the ground. And I will say during Irene, I feel like because we didn't do what we were supposed to do as a state, go co-locate with FEMA, actually, we did what we thought we should do, which is go out to the communities, go hear from communities. I mean, we were out as interagency teams all over the state for like 3 months following the disaster. And I think we were able to be with communities as they had to grieve so much loss, so much pain. And I think as a result, we might have been getting a little more on the ground more quickly in some ways. That said, I do not want to criticize the agents, the state, who has been managing to the best of its ability, but from a very different perspective and landscape. I'm sorry I'm jumping around. My testimony is a little more coordinated, but what happened on the ground and where we are on the ground, especially for those folks who don't have their own resources, the ability to recover on their own, that's the so-called long-term recovery for individuals. You know, after Irene, even in the first 4 months, we put together a major report to you, the legislature, that really helped identify what had happened in those first 4 months and really kind of assess the 5 major areas of impact. One was infrastructure. Another was businesses and communities. Another was ecosystem and agriculture. And then there were individuals. And each area, each of those buckets have a different actual strategy that FEMA and VEM tries to deploy. And I don't know, I haven't seen like the after action reports. I'm assuming they're happening, but I feel like they would be helpful for you. We did many of them, even our agency of transportation, and we looked at innovations and we looked at what does resilience mean and what do we need to do differently. I assume that's happening, but I'm not aware of it. And it's important for you to ask and learn what the state feels like they have learned in this area of individual recovery that I'm a part of now. So in the immediate aftermath, many people were working so hard at every level of government and at the community level to help their neighbors mucking out houses. We have a community kitchen academy for months. We were creating meals and distributing meals. We were distributing baby food. We were baby formula, water. We had many communities without water, without potable water for weeks.
Yes.
This went on, and the state helped with this absolutely as well. So I was able to put in orders, and they would come down, and there was massive distribution. So, you know, I do feel like the state does its job, but in addition to that, there's so much needed at the local level because all recovery is local, and so much had happened. And as one of many organizations working so hard at the community level, there was only so far we could stretch our workforce. My housing counselors are working nonstop to try to get people from hotels to housing. I had to redeploy them to do work at the community level. And then when the state set up MARCs, they're called, I bet Eric can tell me what a MARC.
Multi-agency recovery centers.
So we went to the MARCs, we tried to support, and we tried to bring to those centers the resources, the kind of resources that our organization has. But honestly, those in our area weren't as well attended as sort of the community meetings and the literally storefront organizations that set up. And these have now evolved into what are called long-term recovery committees. So here we are 7 months later. I also brought to my testimony one of the reports from FEMA that can show you a lot more detail about the incident itself. I showed you, I attached a copy of what is currently a map of all the long-term recovery committees. And these are now organizations that we hope will be sustained and organized in such a way as that now Capstone is a recipient through the state of a FEMA grant called a long-term disaster case management. So we are being asked to stand up for the state, actually a team of 15 people, which includes case managers, 5 of which would be in the Capstone area, to include Washington, Lamoille, Orange, and the Northeast Kingdom. We've been asked to cover all of that. And then there will be 2 case managers with CVOEO. That's the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. They have a special focus on all of the mobile home parks and home flood recovery going on there, as well as in Rutland, even though it's not in their territory, and Chittenden County. And also SEVCA, the Southeast Vermont, they will have 2. So those are 2 case managers. So there will be 9 case managers. Capstone will house a program manager, a case management supervisor, as well as construction coordinators and a data manager. That is the FEMA grant that we have finally received and are hiring for. And we've got about, I think, 7 out of an eventual team of 15 to cover the whole state. So that's the role. And the role is that we work on individuals. You know, you think about, of the 6,300 some odd individuals that filed for individual assistance. I think I have it in my testimony. You know, a significant portion of people have resources. They have savings. They can get loans. They have assets, collateral, and they can recover. But there is a significant portion of people who do not have, who live on the margins, who live paycheck to paycheck, and who have been displaced and dislocated, and they aren't going to be able to get back into their housing or move forward without more support. And that is the case management that's really getting started now. I want to mention that there is one long-term recovery committee called the Hope Coalition in Central Vermont, which is an interfaith entity, really faith-based organization that has already mobilized teams from Texas and Massachusetts to come and rebuild all fall. They were rebuilding homes. So that's what's envisioned. And this system is also connected to the Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund, which now is chaired by Chris Graff. So the cases that our case managers and the Long-Term Recovery Committee case managers will bring to the Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund, I believe that they will have up to $25,000 to help with their recovery. So that is the system of individual recovery that's underway, just really getting off the ground 7 months after this disaster. And I know that there are people who are living in homes that are not safe and sanitary. They are not warm because there's nowhere for them to go. And it's really very distressing, and there is a lot of despair, a lot of pain, a lot of frustration and anger at the local level. And I want you to know I received that, and I understand it. And I wish that we might think now about resilience to have a strategy that is more proactive. And it's why I think about the possible role of nonprofits, of there being sort of a designated nonprofit whose job it is to be there, to be prepared, to be trained, to know where the local options for secondary shelters. I appreciate that conversation. We had so many shelter conversations after Irene. And I
Yeah.
want you to know the Red Cross, I was on the board of the Red Cross for a while because we started a whole initiative to actually mobilize and train local shelters. I don't know what happened to that, but they were.
It fell apart, as far as I can tell. 'Cause-
So there was a new chair, I think, or ED. So it's just, there are so many things that we're doing too late to be meeting the needs in a way that I think is as respectful as we want to be, which isn't to say we all haven't been working tirelessly, including every member of the whole team of FEMA and state workers who are actually trying to create this system. But when you get to this grassroots, there's a missing link. And I think it's something to be thinking of. So there's an organization across the country, VOAD, Volunteers Active in Disaster or something. And I believe that we had talked after Irene about a COAD, communities organized active against disaster. So I have some very specific recommendations in my written testimony that just sort of raise, please think about the system about individual recovery and response. I think we're pretty good at response, but it's what about after, we have so many people suffering right now. And frankly, I don't think anybody's aware of this. I think people look at this as the rear view mirror. It's the front window for me, folks. I'm not sure I included in here, one day after December, I asked my food shelf coordinator to please do a wellness check in all of our frontline workers. And just one day, there were so many unbelievable stories of people living in the parking lot, living in their cars, living still couch surfing. You're going to see in here, if you read my testimony, the number of families in Barre City schools, there's 200 flood impacted kiddos who have lived through trauma and are still living with trauma. And that's in addition to 100 unhoused kiddos, young people. That's one school system. Yeah. So I feel like I'm wandering and saying a number of things, but it is what I'm thinking about right now. Maybe I can answer questions.
Stu, thank you so much for bringing it back down to that level. We've been thinking so much about sort of governmental systems and how to make the government work better. But we did tour Barre last Friday. The committee did a field trip to Barre, and we did, in fact, stood in the street in the neighborhood that was hit the hardest, and it was clear that people were still living in several of the homes that had basically been destroyed. There were dogs barking in the windows and things like that. So it was clear that people were living in places that they really shouldn't be, but probably had no other option. And we got a lot of detailed information about what that city is trying to do for recovery. And and we've heard from a number of people that have tried to bring it to this level of the individual as well, many of nonprofit organizations. The suggestion or the conversation about navigators has come up multiple times. It's great to hear that the grant has finally come through and that you and CVOEO and others are working on getting these navigators out to help people. And yes, it's way too late. I mean, they're still going to be able to do good things, but it should have happened so much earlier. So do you have more thoughts about how we can, I guess, have these people at the ready for when it happens again? Your concept of the designated agency kind of is interesting to think about.
Well, after Irene, because there was no expectation that there would be some role that FEMA might play. And by the way, this is the first time when we had this grant after Irene, we were one of the only 2 states that ever did this. So it was very new at the time. But the state hired 10 case managers immediately, and they utilized the community action agencies. So there was case management going on the ground. Now, I was trying to avail support because it's not just helping muck out homes, it's helping people apply for FEMA. It's very complex for many people. And if you don't have a phone and you don't have a home, you don't have power, you don't have a computer, or you're not computer literate, or you don't speak the language, it needs a navigator. That's a good word. I will distinguish between navigator and case manager, which is what we are doing, because case managers are looking at, have training at a whole number of ways to be thinking about the challenges ahead. I want to mention, so one idea could be that there is a plan in place so that and it definitely doesn't need to be the caps. It could be quite different per region. And this problem of regions is something that I went mad with after Irene. You know, there's counties, there's regional planning commissions, there's so many jurisdictions. It's something that I appreciate about the cap agencies. There's 5, you know, those are easy. That's an easy number. And I feel like the designation is helpful, but we aren't as local as other organizations because we are large. We're large organizations. The United Way in our region is playing a really critical role. So there could be an organization that has sustainability that is designated to stand up some trained navigators and case managers right away. And that, that we fund it right away. One of the things that we did after Irene, and I always remember getting a call from the utility, some leader of a utility, middle of the night, saying, you've got to throw everything you've got at this. Do not worry about how you're paying for it. This is a disaster. Throw everything at it. And that was such an important piece of information that made a difference. And it doesn't work if you're waiting for FEMA, if you're waiting for approval, if you're waiting, you've got to go. And if there was an entity that knew, and I will tell you, the community action agencies receive a federal BROC grant. We were immediately in COVID given extra money. So I immediately hired and spent money because I said, I know I'll figure out how we're going to pay for it later. And it made such a difference on the ground, how much we were able to do for getting people into these hotels, for feeding them. We fed people 3 meals a day, mobilized volunteers. I mean, just the things we were able to do, knowing, just do it. So if we can think in that mindset and pre-designate potentially a local nonprofit, if there was a fund that we knew was available, and I do wonder about the interest that the treasurer is earning. I do want to say to his point, and two things. One, I want to talk about home buyouts. And then before I do that, I just quickly want to say, because I put out an email and asked people for ideas, and an idea that has come back, which is urgent and which might relate to your bill and the treasurer. We have people who can't leave their home because they have to pay a mortgage on their home that they can't live in, and they can't afford mortgage plus rent. Could there be a revolving loan fund at the municipal level to support people in that situation? I know he's working on the grand list and helping municipalities with these unbelievable gaps. But could we be thinking about the individual home flood survivor who cannot afford to leave and are living in an unsafe situation because they can't do the mortgage plus the rent? So just an idea. But this issue of upfront money and being able to move quickly and not waiting and waiting, this is the problem, and you must have seen it in Barrie. We have people who want to do a home buyout who are right now so afraid to go back to their home that they're willing to consider moving out of that and going through that process. It is a lengthy and complex process. Yeah. I believe that we fronted the money, and we did get to 90-10 in Irene, and then we got to 100%. But I believe we had a fund available right away. I think it was through VITA to help with these home buyouts, because in a year from now, they will have no choice but to go back, and then you can't buy out the property. So thinking strategically about getting money available much more quickly, and I'm talking about for this disaster, not future disasters, so that we can help people who don't want to go back move on. Now, of course, there's lots of challenges to that because there's nowhere for them to go, which is not the problem we had in Irene. We have very different housing market, very different conditions, but no matter what, people can't leave And then, you know, we had so many examples of, like in Northfield, I believe we had a dozen or 15 homes that we did a home buyout of a whole neighborhood on River Street. And that became a park and a floodway. And in July 2023, that whole area flooded as it's supposed to do, exactly as designed, and the rest of Northfield didn't. And that's why getting that floodplain restoration and getting the home buyouts is so urgently needed now and into the future. And we need to have a better strategy for money up front for that.
Yes, absolutely. Senator Bukowski has a question.
Yeah, so circling back to the sort of question of navigators and having a group of people trained and ready to go, I guess I'm a little curious why you feel like it would be better to stand up a nonprofit to do that and not do that within state government.
Well, you can give it a try in state government, but there isn't a local neighborhood-based connection. I mean, what we did do, when we received the thumbs up, yes, FEMA's going to fund this, and why don't you get started? I said, it will take us months to start hiring. It's not simple. Can we utilize state employees? So they did. They created something called a bridge case management team. But this was employees who had other jobs, and they were giving of their time, and they were not trained in human services and in case management, and they did the best they could at a very high level. But I don't know whether you can, I'm not against having it be at state government at all, but I've noticed the role of nonprofits as a different level that's closer to the ground. Anything would be a great improvement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, certainly wouldn't want someone being pulled from their regular job, but I think, we have other agencies, we have district offices for Department of Children and Families and Agency of Human Services that I feel like this could be housed in state government, certainly not like the bridge was, where it was like, here, figure this out, but trained people.
Senator Clarkson.
So we have, an interesting model in the National Guard who take people living everyday lives and they meet once every, I don't know how often they meet, but they come together like every 6 weeks or every 2 months.
They train 1 weekend a month, then 2 weeks.
Yeah, 1 weekend off, right?
And then
we could create the same kind of community-based volunteer team of people who are trained, and we could do shelters and navigators at the same time. And
I think, not to jump in, but one of the things, lots of local groups came up after Irene, and what you'll get is, after a while, if they don't have a specific task, then they just start to fall away. So
I know.
you create those tasks.
I'm part of it.
Right, yeah, so we talked about co-eds.
I know, so that's why something like the National Guard model that keeps their toes to the fire and has, you gather every, whatever, if we could shake it up.
Maybe it could be something of the National Guard, a civilian emergency corps.
Yes.
I think that's a great
something
idea.
to talk about with Greg.
And Eric, I'm sure you have other thoughts about this because this is your world. It's not my world. I'm just here working at the street level and feeling like we need to do better.
The National Guard also isn't volunteer, is it?
The National Guard?
Is it volunteer?
Yeah.
You volunteer to go in and then it's not volunteer anymore.
Yeah, that's paid. It's paid.
Okay.
And it's also, there's a much more formal structure and formal connection.
Yeah, I just think they're paid for the work they're doing.
Yeah, I understand that, but what I am trying to get at is they have a way to consistently keep people engaged and focused on this and on their work. And it could be different. It could be the National Guard and a civilian corps. We could figure out how to pay for it through the feds. That would be great. But really very local, as Sue has said, very anchored in our communities, but also or regionally. I think somehow come up with some way to keep it consistent, because you're right, it falls apart. Sue and I watched it fall apart after Irene. I mean, it just was really frustrating because there was so
that
much
sense of urgency and mission. And I think I love your idea of the National Guard because that is a mission. And it is that level of training that I think would be so beneficial Do any states, Eric, utilize their guard in this way? I know we've called out the guard for various tasks, but I
We
don't
did.
know if it's,
Not at the case manager level, no, we sent the guard out as, we call them local liaisons, where they go out and they talk to the towns and ask them what they needed.
They did
But
some
not like people.
door to
The
door stuff.
SCFC mostly works with municipalities.
Yeah, they drop water and food.
Well, they went to the town and said, town, what do you need? And the town said, I need water and food. And so, you know, the
Yeah.
reaches out because we were having.
but you know, like towns are I just feel like Vermont municipalities cannot be expected to respond, to recover. You know, they have to understand FEMA. They are expected to mobilize emergency response teams. They're supposed to assess their damage and plan their recovery. They have all of these humanitarian crises, and they don't have. So I feel like we put a lot on our towns. It makes sense that they would go to the towns because who else? But let me tell you, it was all a lot of volunteers on the ground, which is why I feel like there's a role for nonprofits. I mean, nonprofits stood up very quickly.
And we have those again re-emerging in slightly different ways, in some ways a little more professionally in our resiliency groups and committees around the state now that I see there.
And Jason Gosling, who's in charge of shelters, is the IA coordinator, individual assistance coordinator. So there's public assistance, towns, and then there's individual assistance from FEMA. Those are the two delineations. So the individual assistance is really that case managers, and the AHS is the one that
And
So,
doing those, yeah,
stood
we'll
up
have
case
him.
managers, got the bridge case
Yeah.
managers, now got Capstone. So having them in, we have an IA plan, and it's really in their wheelhouse, and not to kick the can, but it's not VEM's wheelhouse. It's the individual assistance coordinator who's
Yeah.
Jason.
That's great.
Yeah, and Jason has done. I don't think he's slept in years
I
because he
need 10
had
more
to do.
Jasons, to be honest.
Okay.
We need 10 more
Put
Jasons.
that in the bill.
I think we have one IA coordinator, right?
Yes.
In charge of all sheltering and all response and all recovery now. And it is and dealing with, you know, all of the FEMA programs, individual assistance, housing assistance, this direct housing assistance that.
This is his real job.
He's the director of emergency, he's the emergency management director for AHS.
Okay,
So that's where he lives.
all right. Well, we'll have him in to talk about
It's
this.
He doesn't actually live there.
So,
I think these days he might, but AHS is technically the IA, they're in charge of it.
that makes sense. That makes sense, yeah. Senator Clarkson.
Whatever my name is. Alice,
Hey, you.
yeah, well, I don't actually respond to hate you, but Allison works pretty well. Eric and I have been having this conversation today because we are trying to figure out how to thread the needle between not doing rental registry again, but beefing up the landlord certificate so that we can have a notion when people are displaced in an emergency, how we can know where there are apartments or places that we could house them in a disaster. And so Sue, we're not gonna talk about that here, but I'd love to, you who know so much and Eric who knows so much, I might start an email chain tonight after this wedding and parties to chat about how maybe it's through the individual assistance team that the housing.
What's difficult.
It is difficult
Well,
and
let me
but-
explain what's so difficult, because FEMA is very, and it must be protective of its information. It receives individual information that it must protect.
Right, and so
So
does the
that
tax
is
part.
what's part of such a hard thing. So these housing programs they were bringing in, we'd have people coming to Capstone who need housing, but I couldn't put them into the FEMA bucket because FEMA is in charge of. Anyway, that's a whole nother discussion, but it's related to what you're saying.
I'm just gonna start that. I just wanted to give you both a heads up while you're both in the same room, because I'd love to figure out how we can, you know, what we can do with this.
Okay. Well, for now, it's after 5. It's been a long day. I think everyone's tired. Sue, thank you so much for joining us late in the day and for all of your work out there on the front lines. It's really appreciated. Take care of yourself.
Thank you,
And,
Sue.
thanks for being here.
It's lovely to see
Thank you
you.
for everything.
Take care.
I love seeing you all, as you know.
I love